Greetings everyone. I decided that I would make a video about the rise to power of Napoleon Bonaparte because I couldn't find a very clear short video that really captures the craziness around Napoleon's rise to power. It's a great example of how a relatively ordinary person, given the right amount of talent, drive, and luck, can have an incredibly disproportionate impact on the trajectory of history. To begin with, Napoleon, interestingly, is not really French at all. His family is from Corsica. They had roots going back to Florence in the Middle Ages. And if we were to pronounce Napoleon's name as it was when he was born, before he Frenchified it, it'd be Napoleon Bonaparte. Corsica had only relatively recently been incorporated into the Kingdom of France. And interestingly, Napoleon and members of his family actually supported the Corsican independence movement at the beginning of the French Revolution, at the very beginning, that is. But Napoleon was kind of an interesting kid. He was a bit of a nerd, was frail, not particularly short, but we maybe would say he had a cross-country type build, and so was picked on because of that. But he read a ton of books. Especially books about military history, and especially about Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, two ancient generals, but also ancient politicians. And this is important because for Napoleon, military success was always intertwined with political ambition, even in his mindset as a young man. He won a scholarship to the École Militaire in Paris, which was an extremely prestigious military academy, but he was picked on there because of his, his body type, because his family was from a relatively, poor aristocratic line in Corsica, and for his Corsican accent, which made him really stand out from his peers. So there are really four key moments, militarily speaking, in Napoleon's rise. The first is his responsibility for the recapture of Toulon from the British. The second is when he saved the government from pro-monarchist protesters in the Vendémiaire revolt. I'm sorry, I'm butchering the French pronunciation, I'm sure. When he defeated the Austrians and ended the War of the First Coalition in the First Italian campaign, and when he temporarily conquered Egypt from the Mamluk rulers of that ancient land. So in 1793, at the Siege of Toulon, as a young man in his early 20s, he basically gets promoted to have control over the military conduct of the siege because of his affiliation with Robespierre and the Jacobin Party. His senior officers, who were supposed to be in charge, did not want to question Robespierre's orders because they didn't want to get their head cut off back in Paris. So through a combination of his logistical prowess, inspirational motivation speeches to the men, and his own brilliance and physical courage, the French recaptured the city. This instantly made him a bit of a celebrity, and he was promoted to the rank of brigadier general. In 1795, royalist supporters were trying to destroy the government in Paris, and Napoleon happened to be on leave. He said he was sick, and so he went to Paris, but he probably wasn't sick. He just wanted to get away from the army for a little bit. Once again, one of these crazy, fortuitous circumstances, at least if you're Napoleon. And the National Convention, the government at the time, said, please put down this revolt. And he says, I'll only put down the revolt if you give me full control over the military in Paris. They really don't have a choice, so they give it to him. And he uses cannon fire to put down the mob. This is an important moment for Napoleon because it once again makes him the savior of France, and gets him promotion, this time to have control of the entire army of Italy. But it's also important because it's the first time in the course of the French Revolution where the military is willing to fire on protesters in Paris. Up to this point in the past, the military didn't really have that kind of gumption to stand up to protesters. They were more often going along with the protesters. And so with the Vendémiaire revolt, or at least it's getting quashed by Napoleon, we see the end of mob rule in Paris. All right, so Napoleon goes to Italy and just kicks the pants off of all these old Austrian generals. We can go into a lot of detail about how he accomplishes this, but once again, through a combination of personal courage, logistical talent, tactical brilliance, he forces the first coalition to seek peace terms. So this is Prussia, Austria, and Britain. And he establishes little client republics throughout northern Italy that eventually are going to sow the seeds of Italian nationalism. Because keep in mind, at this point, Italy really hadn't been governed by Italians for centuries. Northern Italy was mainly controlled by the Austrians. Southern Italy was mainly controlled by the Bourbon Spaniards. So he gave them some self-government, some autonomy, and this was going to have a big impact in the next century. All right, so what has he done so far? He's conquered most of northern Italy for France. Some of it has directly been annexed by France. Other parts of it are these kind of client republics. And when he's in northern Italy, he takes revolutionary measures to suppress religious orders, monasteries, other monastic groups, ends serfdom, and limits noble privilege. One of the things that's interesting about Napoleon is he's going to ennoble his own supporters once he comes to power. So he's not against different classes of society, but he thinks those classes should be organized by talent, not by birth. So in 1797, in the Fructidorian coup, or the coup d'etat of Fructidor, there's a pro-peace party and pro-monarchist party that wants to restore the ancient regime. Members of the Republic seek help from Napoleon, so Napoleon sends one of his generals from Italy to put down this conservative counter-revolution. And the Fructidorian Directory, the directory that kind of spawns out of this suppressed coup, ends up not making peace with Britain, but does make peace with Austria. And this is important for Napoleon because now the Directory is entirely dependent upon Napoleon to have stability in the country. Because the Directory government is now reliant on Napoleon, they really want to get rid of him. They want him out of Paris, they want him out of France, and maybe if he finds himself on the wrong end of a Mamluk saber adventuring in Egypt, that would be good for the Directory. So they send him to Egypt. Now Napoleon doesn't see this as the kind of exile that it was perhaps meant to be. Ostensibly, the reason for sending Napoleon to Egypt was to limit British influence in the region and threaten the security of British India, which was already a super valuable colony of the British East India Company. So he goes over to Egypt, conquers it from the kind of ruling elite, the Mamluks, but he gets cut off by the British Navy at the Battle of the Nile. And this is his first encounter with Admiral Nelson, who's going to foil his attempts at invading England through his victory over the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. But that's for a later day. So Napoleon's like, what am I going to do? I'm just going to conquer the Middle East. And he takes his army out of Egypt and goes into the Holy Land, where he meets with a series of setbacks. He had ambitions of having an Alexander the Great type conquest of the entire Middle East and getting all the way to India. That was never going to happen. It was logistically basically impossible for his army. So he retreats back into Egypt in 1799 and abandons his army. He takes off in a little sloop and slips past the British Navy, makes his way back to France. A lot of the French officers that were in this military expedition to the Middle East never forgive Napoleon. And it's an example of kind of a dark side of Napoleon's personality is at the end of the day, yeah, it's great to be patriotic, but Napoleon always comes first. Interestingly, the Rosetta Stone was uncovered during Napoleon's military adventures in Egypt, and this is the stone that's going to allow antiquarians to translate hieroglyphics, because the stone contains hieroglyphics, Egyptian, Coptic, and Greek. All right, so now we get to the end of Napoleon's rise to power in the coup d'etat of 1799. So after the Fructidorian coup of 1797 that we already talked about, or really the kind of failed coup, the Directory had become a dictatorship, and it was an unstable form of government. It was losing its connection with the revolutionary ideals. And so Abbé Sieyès, y'all remember him, 1789, 10 years before he wrote What is the Third Estate? He's still around. Somehow he survives the terror. And he asked Napoleon for help in overthrowing the Directory so they can establish a consulate government. And this was going to be based off of the model of ancient Rome, except instead of having 2 consuls like in ancient Rome, Abbé Sieyès wanted to have 3 consuls, one of whom would be himself, Abbé Sieyès, the other would be Napoleon, and the third is some other guy that you don't really need to know about because he has no influence on the story whatsoever. So this overthrow of the Directory is called the coup d'etat Brumaire, and this is named after the month in which it occurs, according to the French Revolutionary calendar. Napoleon brings his soldiers into the government chambers, kicks them out of their office, and installs this consulate government with himself as first consul. Now, Abbé Sieyès thought that he was going to be able to control this new government. I mean, Napoleon's a young man. He's barely 30 years old. How is he going to have the chutzpah to proclaim himself the supreme leader? But that is exactly what he does. At their first meeting, he essentially sits down in the office, kicks his boots up onto the table and says, well, thanks guys, but I'm in charge. And this begins Napoleon's basically, single-handed rule of France that will last until 1814, and then we'll get started up again in 1815 after he escapes from Elba. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks. See you later.